So gender is an interesting subject and topic to address in an event like this and a day like this today, from the perspective of how we define gender, how we see our place in the idea of gender. So what I'm going to do for the next, say, about 40 minutes is take you through how I see this world of gender in the larger framework of diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, and so on and so forth. And what we can possibly do is that spend the next 15 to 20 minutes in the end addressing questions. I have a lot of material, but I'm going to stop wherever we are in 40 minutes, primarily because I think the meat of what I want to say to you and is exciting is right from the beginning. So gender per se is a social construct. And for the longest time, it's been seen as a social construct of relationships and potential roles that men and women hold with reference to each other. Now, the idea of men and women here is not anything but biology. So we are not talking about orientation or preference. We're only talking about physicality. But gender concerns men and women, including conceptions of femininity and masculinity, is to say, how do I see myself? Beyond my biology, what's my perception of my own self? It's also about biological differences, and it's greatly defined and very specifically defined as a difference between gender and sex. And I'm going to build on this a little further as we go along. So for a lot of us in organizations as well as practitioners, there seems to be a conversation around women that tends to happen when we talk about gender. And one of the things I want to say to you is that let's not confuse this with women's studies or feminism or feminist leadership. It isn't. Gender actually includes both men and women. So I'd like you to do a quick reflection before we move on. What we'll do with reflections is that it'll show up, Priyanka, I think it shows up as a poll, right?
Yes.
Yes, and I'll continue with the session while you take the poll and keep listening, given that you've got your lunch right in front of you and you're taking a poll and have the luxury of sitting back and listening to this idea develop as we explore it. So this is absolutely incredible and profound work of Sam Killerman. And the best way I can possibly explain gender. So he calls this illustration the gender-bred person, and let me tell you what he really means. He says, let's look at gender in 4 categories. One is identity, expression, biological sex, and our sexual orientation. So gender identity, like all the others, are on a continuum. They're not either or, which is to say that I could be on one end of the continuum of identity and quite another of the continuum on expression and quite another place on biological sex as well as sexual orientation. So if you start plotting yourself and saying, where do I sit? What is my clear identification? You will find that, and if you're really true to yourself, you'll find that this continuum defines how identity is defined across the world. It's not, all of it is culturally agnostic. It is it does not adhere to any kind of cultural or social or societal or academic or biological perspective. Important to understand that the idea of the continuum tells us that at various levels of the continuum, there might be interrelations, but not interconnections. What does that mean? Is that if I'm a woman and my gender expression is androgynous or more masculine, it does not take away the fact that I'm a woman. But it connects me further to saying, all right, at what stage of my life did my leadership style become more androgynous or masculine? What is the industry I work in? So for instance, if I'm a woman who works on the shop floor in manufacturing of cars, and I work with a lot of men, there's possibly the potential that I will show up as somebody who has an ability to leverage her masculine competencies. Now, my biological sex in this case uh, still might be female. My sexual orientation it could be anywhere on the continuum, which is to say that each one of us, one lives in these layers, the other defines ourselves through these layers, and the third, that we don't have to be at one end of the continuum. All in all, complex idea, profound but complex. And why is it important for us to understand this? Is so that when we look at ourselves and look at others, we start giving attention to the idea that representation of people does not mean identity of people. So there are more men in a system or more women in a system does not mean that their identity is with male. Expression tells us that now there might be different forms of expression, and multiple expressions might exist. And as human beings, it's now our social, moral, ethical, and business imperative for us to understand that this exists across the spectrum. Attention to diversity of sexual orientation is very, very critically important in today's world. We have ignored this matter long enough. Again, here it's important for us to understand that social justice and equality within a system, especially at the workplace, can only happen when we start honoring the differences amongst us, which actually set the pathway to sameness. So gender is not heteronormative. You can identify with any, and our focus in discussion is on expression of masculinity and femininity, not men and women. It's also important to attend to the intersectionality of what might be identity, expression, sex, and orientation. All in all, when we talk about gender, what I'd like you to do is to start saying, what is the strength of the other? How do they self-identify? And how can we actually leverage the strengths through how every individual identifies to create a system that is more inclusive, that's more equitable, that's more equal, and where there is greater ownership and belonging. There's also a lot of confusion around equity, parity, and intelligence. It's important to understand that. So parity is simple. It says equal contribution of men and women, which means equal contribution, equal compensation. Equity, on the other hand, says that there is no equitable way to look at people. We need to have a specific way of looking at them. And a specificity of view is actually an equitable view, which is to say that men and women have different roles, responsibilities, abilities, preferences, so on and so forth. And that allows us to, I'm so sorry for this thing that's showing up on my computer, and that allows us to show up differently. Intelligence is this greater, grander, beautiful idea that allows us to leverage our differences and leverage the strengths that exist, not in a group of men and women, but individually. So what's the strength that exists in Preeti? What is her capability? What is her style? And how can we leverage that for the most part? Now, there are some dated but fundamental beliefs that we live in the world today, and these could be cultural, but I think they're across the world. One is that we want a balanced gender representation in business, in government, in education, and we believe that that will sort it all out. There couldn't be anything further from the truth, because representation has nothing to do with value orientation. Treating everybody equally will establish equality. Again, that's not true, because we don't need to be treated equally. We need to be treated specifically. Eradicating bias is all that you need to do. Well, it's an important aspect of what we need to do, but not all. And all genders are identical on the inside. So if we have 10 women in a room, every woman is different. If you have 10 men in a room, every man is different, because their own sense of expression, identity, orientation, belonging, everything is different. So research shows that we need more, and that none of the above is a clear identification of gender reality. Which leads me to a quick reflection too. And like I said, we'll do these reflections, the polls will open, and I will continue the session while you fulfill the poll. And I'm hoping that we can, at the end of this, show you the results of the poll. I'm not sure, none if I have not used the poll before, but Priyanka will let us know. Okay, I guess it's up, Priyanka?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. So the big idea that I personally am very deeply invested in and I'd like you to focus on is the idea of gender intelligence. Now, gender intelligence, this was created by Barbara Annis, but more importantly, what does it really say? And intelligence has been spoken of in the space of gender sparingly but regularly, from the perspective that if you really want to understand men and women, masculinity and femininity, you want to understand how people think and how they act, you want to appreciate the gender related tendencies, differences, and sameness, you want to be able to engage with specificity and then leverage that specificity. It's also about appreciating what occurs naturally rather than attitudinally. And there's a lot of imposition of how we've seen the world. Patriarchal societies will see the idea of women and men very, very differently. And let's not forget that however we may project it, there's pressure on both. So we're saying let's not just ignore the idea that let's not be gender blind. Let's be gender intelligent. And gender blind is what patriarchy teaches us, is to say, well, this is how it is. There's no other way to be. But let's start celebrating, let's start embracing, let's start understanding what are the differences, how do we harness them, so that not only can individuals be more productive, innovative, and creative, but communities and organizations can go in the same direction. So this is a culture of integrated thinking and the beginning of a new conversation. So what's the science behind this? And I think for today's session, if I was to end at what I'm going to show you, I personally would be delighted and glad, because this is fairly groundbreaking. Now, I'm bringing in the idea of neuroscience, and I'm saying to you is that the brain has very specific aspects that speak differently to men and differently to women. Now, I'm talking about sex here, to say men are biologically different from women. This might seem obvious, but we're talking about the brain, and thus it's not as obvious. So what are these physiological differences in the brain? And we've taken 6 aspects of the brain, or 6 parts of the brain, and I'm going to sort of somewhere read this out to you because it's so incredible. Now, that part of the brain, which is called the corpus callosum, is where we process all information. It's a bundle of nerves and connects the left and the right hemisphere. This part of the brain is larger in women than it is in men. And the impact of that is that when men are solving problems, they like to concentrate on one aspect of reasoning. Let's get this sorted. While women are working on a problem, they have this ability to be logical and creative simultaneously and taking a wider perspective on things. Both are important, both are useful, and both are very, very telling. The anterior cortex is that part of our brain which supports us in unconscious functions such as digestion, blood pressure, heart rate, etc., etc. This too is larger in women than in men. Now, the role that this plays is that women's brains are designed to quickly assess thoughts, beliefs, and the intentions that others might hold. And this is what they call, I have a feeling, I have a gut that this is what's happening. Because the ability of a woman to understand her ecosystem is very different from a man's. Men, on the other hand, might turn around and say, I don't get it. What is this gut feeling? What is this whole idea of intuition? But the brain is so differently structured that it actually shows up differently. The insular cortex is, again, very complex, influences our emotional response. This is twice as large in women than men. Now, what happens here is that because of the size of the insular cortex, women will always remember more. And thus, they draw upon past memories, learn from them, make sure that they don't use them in the future. And they are very conscious about taking a risk. They don't jump into things very easily. The amygdala, which is also known as the fight or flight response to any kind of stress or danger or fear. This is larger in men than in women. And here it allows men to take really rapid decisions and immediate actions basis any kind of sensory input. So, which is one of the reasons we say that men are more sporty, which is actually not true. Men are sporty, women are sporty as well, but men have a different sensory response to any kind of external stimuli. The prefrontal cortex is what controls judgment, decision making, and thinking that happens in sequence or consequential thinking. Say what happens, what's the result of this? What's the result of A is B, the result of C is D, and so on and so forth. This is again larger in women and actually develops very early in girls. Now, the source of enhanced consequential thinking in women is that they can predict outcomes. They'll say, what if this happens? Quite like the previous one. What might happen in the future? So it's almost like thinking ahead. Now, the cerebellum is what contributes to coordination, precision, and accuracy. And men have a larger cerebellum than women. It influences men to communicate more non-verbally and women to communicate more with words. Now, this is neuroscience, simple enough. No problem with this. This is how we are structured. Men and women are different and real. This is very, very real. But there's another part to this. This is what we call nature. The nurture part of this is that aspect of us, which is to say, what is it that I am inspiring, cultivating, inviting, engaging? How do I build myself or those around me for the future? So the first myth that we bust is that men and women are not the same on the inside. We can't make that assumption. In fact, when we do that, we undervalue the difference. We try and create or impose sameness, which leads to a problem. Right? It also is to say that we have relegated women to softer roles. We have nurtured a great deal of patriarchy in our cultures and ecosystems. And this brings us to a place where we only go by what nature shows up. But actually, the brain is so incredibly plastic that you could nurture a man to have feminine attributes and competencies, and exactly the opposite as well. And wouldn't it be a wonderful place where not only were we contributing and leveraging our nature, but we were also nurturing that part of us that is actually more prominent in the other. So what is our strength through differences? Like I said, imagine if you had the ability to actually look at both styles. Wouldn't that be complementary in the place of work, at homes, within relationships? Wouldn't there be greater cognitive, emotional, spiritual connection between people because we could actually understand each other? So our goal as practitioners is to help men and women recognize the difference, value the part that they can actually nurture, and start operating in a style that is more generous as well as more appreciative of each other. What this does is helps men and women again relate to each other, not only as business colleagues, but as people who are a part of this incredible planet and have the responsibility of engagement. It applies everywhere. It applies to us as parents, as partners, as leaders, as team members, as those who set up an organization, and so on and so forth. So understanding that our differences are complementary, they are interdependent, they are not offsetting weaknesses, is extremely important for us to build a world of what I call strength through differences. With whatever you've learned until now, could you use the chat box, and I'm going to pause here for about 2 minutes. Use the chat box and say, what is the one myth that you have busted or has been busted for you in the conversation that we've had until now? All right, let's continue. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat box till I stop sharing, so I will have to come back to some of these responses later, unless, Priyanka, I'm missing something and there's another way to do it.
No, I think while you're sharing, it wouldn't be visible, but we do have a couple of great comments here already coming up in the chat.
Would you be kind enough to read them out?
Yes, sure. So Shatabdi says parity versus equity. That was the myth that got busted. VK says that men and women traits can be nurtured. Kasturi says that there is more to gender than just being male or female. Natasha says you have just reinforced that gender norms are complex when not understood. And Preeti says the need to celebrate, not embrace differences. Shatabdi is asking the continuum model was fabulous, missed to see who it was by.
It's by a gentleman by the name of Sam Killerman. SAM
Right.
Killerman, as in KILLERMAN. If you look him up, you'll see absolutely outstanding resources by him.
So I'm just writing his name in the chat as well for anyone that wants to.
Thank you. Thank you. So moving on. Why is gender intelligence important as a leadership style? Now, I do want to say that we might have varying seniorities on the conversation today. And I want to make a quick disclaimer around the idea of leadership. Leadership is not about seniority. Leadership is about a mindset. And you will, and you are, and you have in the past always used your leadership ability to move ahead in life, at the workplace, in social settings, wherever you might be operating. So when I say why is gender intelligence important, or why is it next in the evolution of gender intelligent leadership, it equally applies to everybody across seniorities. And there are a couple of axioms that are important for us to remember. One is to say that this world that we live in is one of not even complexity, I'd say it's a hyper complex, diverse world. And your thinking as a leader and as an individual has to be equal at the very minimum and ideally superior to the complexity of your ecosystem. For instance, if you look at COVID, what has happened in this ecosystem is COVID has completely thrown people off their center. And it shows up in many, many different ways. I'll give you a quick example. COVID has some way reinforced patriarchy. While it has actually seconded all of us into our homes and said, till the time we don't figure out what is really happening, you're not allowed to come out of your homes. Everybody is under lockdown of some sort or the other. What has happened is that organizations started to believe that, my God, this is great. Now everybody wanted to work from home. Everybody wanted more flexibility. They've got it. But the fact of the matter is, this is not about flexibility. What has happened is that the little time women got when they left home until the time they got to office, which was me time, is lost. The shadow pandemic, domestic violence, being overworked at home because now patriarchy is not taught most of the men to actually be committed to housework. And these are very generalized statements, so I hope it doesn't give rise to any sensitivity. I'm talking about this conceptually and with no personal comments whatsoever, is that patriarchy does not allow a shift. And given the pandemic, women at home are currently doing more jobs than they were doing. They are managing their homes as well as they're managing their works. Relationships that were supposed to get better have gotten worse. The amount of reporting that is happening around stress, mental health, and violence has gone out of the roof. So as a leader, you have to be able to understand this complexity. Because if you have to reverse patriarchy, then you have to be able to stand in it and say, what does it really mean? Your ability to maturely and flexibly hold multiple perspectives is one of the key signs of an effective leader. What does this mean? To be able to see the perspective of, in the space of gender, of men and women, the masculine perspective as well as the feminine perspective, the androgynous perspective as well as the differently abled perspective, you have to be able to look at the entire range and include all in your thinking. This was done by the World Economic Forum, and they put down these 10 competencies as the future of work. And if you really look at them very, very consciously, you'll see that most of them have an element of what used to be called feminine competencies, which is to say that in today's day and age, we might have forgotten the idea that leadership is certainly is a head job required, but there is also room for the heart. It's not the other way around. We can't marginalize how we feel because we have great cognitive abilities. So a gender intelligent leader makes these fundamental shifts. One is they move from sameness to difference because they know and they have the ability to embrace, celebrate, and leverage the difference. From a gender blind meritocracy, you move into a gender intelligent meritocracy. I would like to explain this a little bit. Now, in organizations, we say that we have everybody is the same. When you come in for an interview, everybody will be treated equally. However, here's the deal, and I've actually experienced this and when speaking to young kids in college or out of college, is if I come from a family that did not have the financial ability to send me to an IIM or send me out of the country to do my management studies, my merit in the rung of things is lower than others, even if I might have topped my college. So to give you a real life example, I was speaking to somebody who did her master's in management from Ghaziabad. And she said, I'm top of the class, and I truly couldn't afford to go anywhere else. I also had familial responsibilities. Do we as organizations recognize that this is gender blind meritocracy because we say, one, you're a woman who had responsibilities and had to take care of her parents, and we don't include that when we look at merit, and thus she's always going to have a disadvantage. The other is financial ability did not allow you to move forward. So how do we as organizations start looking at the whole story rather than the part story? And to bring it to a greater idea from the organizational perspective, and to say that congruence between intention, behavior, and behavior. I would say intention, belief system, value system, and behavior is extremely critical. Otherwise, there is something or the other that's going to keep popping its head and derailing your path. So the big idea that leadership is masculine values to the neglect of feminine values has been busted by COVID and the pandemic and the World Economic Forum and what's required today. So again, taking the pandemic as an example, I know that organizations actually sat their HR teams down and said, make a call to everybody, listen to what's happening in people's lives, build relationships with them, give them support when they require, support them with flexibility, not to the neglect of, in fact, to the inclusion of the ability to drive for results, the ability to be analytical and draw insights, the ability to be focused and task-oriented, the ability to still leverage strategy. So it's rather than either or idea, it's a both and idea. Which is to say, if you were now to see all that we've discussed from the lens of gender intelligence, you'll say men's model is to say deal with things sequentially. Women's model, many ideas, many issues at the same time. If you have to solve a problem, men will converge on an issue and sort it out. Women will diverge, explore many solutions. Decision, men will isolate the issue for quicker decisions. Women will be more contextual. Teams, there'll be more focus, there'll be more value-driven approach to working for result, working for impact. In the case of women, the value as well as the work will be on the journey as well as the result. I must have a good time while I'm working. In how we lead, men potentially are usually transactional, hierarchical, competitive, and convergent, while women are interactive, participative, collaborative, and divergent. The combination of the two is what makes a winning combination. So Google did this absolutely outstanding study a couple of years ago, and they said, what are the top 10 leadership competencies? This is what showed up. And if you read them, being a good coach, empowering the team, not micromanaging, creating inclusive team environments, showing concern for well being, being productive and result oriented, communicator, listens. If you just do the words that stand out, is that there's a lot of focus on feminine leadership. We also noticed, and this is a DTI research report, which says that organizations that had 12% of all leaders are high performing organizations financially. So what are the shifts that you will make? Like we said, you're moving from sameness to differences to gender intelligent meritocracy and greater congruence. But creating this culture is what's important, because making a personal shift is part shift, but making a whole shift requires a full culture to alter. And that is an integrative principle, which I like to call the polarity of the masculine and the feminine, which inspires us to look at a both and. How can I be profitable and sustainable? How can I be logical and reasoning and have strong reasoning and be intuitive? How can I have cognitive as well as emotional intelligence? How can I be collaborating and competing, and so on and so forth? You all know the Travis Kalanick story. Now, the story, if for those who are not aware, or maybe just a quick recap, was that he set up this absolutely incredible organization that has really shaken the world. However, what he forgot was that his leadership style actually marginalized women to the extent that he had to depart. So how does this affect an organization? Uber clearly lost their founder. Others had to be brought in to step in his place. From an organizational perspective, I think the benefit lies in three specific areas. One is conflict resolution, decision making, and problem solving. You already know the difference. I'm not going to go through the tendencies and the approaches again, but to say that after this session, can you really see this in a manner that who you are, what's your identity, what is your ability, physiological, what is being nurtured, what is your nature and what can be nurtured. And at the same time, can you also see others? Can you also start relating to how others are different from you? I'm going to leave some of this out because it's a little more complicated, but we'll come to reflection 4. I guess it's up.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Priyanka. I'm going to continue so that we have enough time for Q&A. So how does gender intelligence affect the organization, and what are the economics of gender diversity? The reason that's important for us to understand is that you want to have a business case for gender diversity, and that will allow you to move forward in a very, very different fashion. So strength through differences standpoint rather than equality in numbers. You don't need equal number of men and women. You really need to say, whoever I have, am I leveraging their differences? Different genders bring very different perspectives to an organization. Do I have the ability to see that and do something with it? Gender differences are in critical thinking, in management, in leadership. How does that contribute to growth and success? Organizations that are really thoughtful in this can actually build a different paradigm altogether. So this is a very interesting example of a US top retail chain. And they developed five criteria. And they said, let's evaluate the effectiveness of the store. Customer satisfaction, time spent in the store, employee morale, performance, and the quality of the merchandise. See, interestingly, they didn't just go on the quality of the merchandise and the look and feel of the store. They said there's more to it. The very fact that they had that lens was in its own way developmental as a lens. Now, they had 900 stores and they found 8 stores, only 8, were constantly outperforming. 900 to 8 is a scary number. And what did these 8 stores have in common? When they interviewed staff, they realized that all stores had gender balanced management with a low turnover of women. More than just equity in numbers, these stores also focused on equality in value and in contribution. So, are the women speaking up? Are the men speaking up? Is everybody contributing? Or has somebody relegated themselves to a corner? Is everybody coming up? In decision making, they got everyone's perspective in, and especially blended men and women because that allowed different perspectives to come in. And these stores focused on group commissions rather than individual commissions, which meant that they were competing and collaborating. So that was competing being masculine and collaborating being feminine as a traditional competency. But the idea being is actually we shouldn't have to label our competencies as masculine and feminine. They're all one. But we've been labeling them for the longest time because we've been marginalizing something or the other. So research shows us that when leaders are gender intelligent, they add greatest value, one, to a balanced style of leadership, where they themselves are centered, have the ability to see what's going on around them. They have better gender blended teams, quicker market responsiveness, higher talent utilization, and more effective risk management. These research inputs also show that return on equity, where there were higher percentage of women, organizations outperformed the others by 53%. Return on sales outperformed by 42. Return on invested capital by 66. Which is to say, are we inviting more diversity into the room? Different people of different identities into the room. Given that we have different perspectives, don't we need a variety of ideas to make things richer? And if that we were to do that, we would have such great impacting results. So the economic insights that move us towards gender intelligence really are that including women in the conversation, it broadens the company's reach across marketing, sales, and customer service for various reasons, and one of them being that women are greater consumers than men are. And when we bring in gender intelligence into all aspects of business, the results are visible in everything we do. Now, this is only possible when we start looking at a win-win proposition and we say we want to empower men and women. The idea of empowering only women is a false idea. We want to empower both because we want to create awareness in both. This is not only about how do we make women more equitable. Equitable means good for all. So we know that this will improve the bottom line for companies. There'll be greater substantial outcomes towards productivity, towards collaboration, towards greater profitability and on-ground impact for organizations. My sense is I should stop here. And without going into another subtopic, it's 2:27. We have 20 minutes. I'd much rather get into a conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing and get into a chat with all of you, if that's okay.
So Preeti, we actually have to end by 2:30. It's
Oh, really?
Yes, it's 1:45 to 2:30.
All right. So clearly my calendar has been playing mischief. I have a very different understanding.
We could go to the takeaways slide as well. I mean, I do have that ready, so we could do
All
that.
right. So let's then go to that. Would you go there?
I'll put that in the chat. And,
Yes, please.
everyone. I hope you can all see the post in the chat. You can just respond to that.
So let's also know that these quick sessions give us an idea of the subject, not a deep dive. And continue to follow Eleanor Roundtable. Follow me as well. I do open sessions every now and then, and you can always be a part of that if you're interested in learning more. I'd also say read this book called Gender Intelligence by Barbara Annis. Annis spent as Anis. Yes, Marissa, you're right. Companies pay a huge financial price for not being gender intelligent, not be gender intelligent, not be gender blind. Yes, that's right. Gender meritocracy versus gender intelligence was a new and powerful perspective. Right, I think we're just about a minute away. I'm sorry I miscalculated and this time on hand has been shorter than planned. I'm seeing the Bali empowerment should be for all. Gender blended teams in boardrooms are much needed, says Urvashi. There's one question that we can possibly quickly take, which says the science of gender norms is now in studies, but don't you think that what we are now moving to is environment or social impact? Of course we are, but social impact to the neglect of commerce is a bad idea. Please remember, a good way to move in this direction is to remember the and rather than the either or. So a profitable organization, a profitable, efficient, effective individual who's also environmentally aware and holds responsibility for social impact is possibly more powerful than just one or the other. Shivi says gender balance is the way to go. Leveraging the best in each gender would help companies grow and be profitable. Dipali says leadership is a matter of head, but there is room for the heart. Marissa says mainly women only initiate such topics in organizations and forums like these. Not true. But I think that is not true from initiating in forums like these. I think what's important is to know that women bring up this idea because they've experienced marginalization, and thus your experience teaches you how to create more equity because you have empathy now through your own experience. And VK says opportunity for both in the landscape, which I think is a good time to pause. And Priyanka, hand it back to you.